This is the Psychedelic Support Monthly Speaker Series. It's great to have you all here to join us for this very important and interesting conversation with Courtney Watson, who is an expert in this area and has some lived experience that she's going to share with us on this topic of how to combat stigma around psychedelics and drugs in communities of color. Courtney Watson is a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a certified sex therapist who founded Access to Doorways, a 501c3 nonprofit in Oakland, California, that provides subsidies for psychedelic treatments and training programs and supports queer and BIPOC-led projects such as A Table of Our Own, which is an acclaimed film, and the Afrocentric psychedelic protocol called Safe House 7. She also runs Doorway Therapeutic Services, a group practice dedicated to supporting the mental health of QT BIPOC communities. Her work centers on decolonized healing, embodied equity, and expanding access to transformative healing practices for all. And I'm going to share some of the links in the chat that I just mentioned, including Courtney's Instagram and ways to connect with the services that she offers in Oakland. We will record this and share the video after, along with any of these resources that are mentioned throughout the talk. And if you do have questions, there is a box in the lower dashboard called QA. If we have time at the end, we will get to as many as possible. So with that, Courtney, welcome. And if you'd like to share anything else about your practice or to orientate us to your services, we'd love to hear more from you about that. So we appreciate you being here so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been in the psychedelic field since 2020. And for some folks, that's a long time. For some folks, that isn't a long time. I have a ketamine clinic that's a part of the practice, and I just saw this big gap. I saw a gap in my training programs and the various trainings that I did, and I saw gaps in terms of really being able to make sure that communities of color could access legal psychedelic care. So that's why I started the nonprofit. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what are the barriers to stigma. There's a lot of what are the barriers to care? And there's a lot of stigma that plays a part in that, both within and outside of communities of color. So while the title of this talk today is how to combat stigma around psychedelics and drugs in communities of color, I really want to focus on psychedelic healing, structural barriers, and what do we have to know first to be able to understand how we got to where we got, then what are the current options that are available to us, and then finally, what is possible. So if I can share my screen, I'll go ahead and get started. If you see me looking down throughout this presentation, it's because I have my speaker notes on my phone. So,
Thank you.
great. Again, my name is Courtney Watson. I founded both Doorway Therapeutic Services and Access to Doorways. Today, we're going to take time to understand stigma in communities of color and where that drug stigma comes from, examine structural barriers to psychedelic-assisted therapy, and then spend some time. I do not have all the answers on how we're going to fix this, but some strategies to expand access for psychedelic treatment in legal contexts. But I really want to start. Also, I just want to name that like there's a lot of red, white, and blue. We're right on the backs of 4th of July in the US. And it's ironic, right? I'm using these colors ironically. I'm using this theme ironically because what we're talking about is America and the way that America has engaged around drugs and also that impact on communities of color. So just in case it wasn't clear, this is all very ironic. So the foundations of drug criminalization, spoiler, it's about race. This is how drug criminalization started. So at the beginning, we have between the 1870s and 1900s, there was a lot of anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiment that led to opium laws. Opium was commonly used among Chinese laborers in the 19th century. Seen as medicine, seen as a way to relax, seen as all of the ways that we are hoping to engage with psychedelics today was what was taking place before. And then December 6th, 1875, at 609 DuPont Street in San Francisco, there was a raid and 6 people were arrested. And this was in response to the 1875 Opium Den Ordinance that says no person shall in the city or county of San Francisco keep or maintain or become an intimate of or visit or shall in any way contribute to the support of any place, house, or room where opium is smoked or where persons assembled for the purpose of smoking opium occur. Later, federal laws began to criminalize opium smoking, but not morphine or not laudanum, which were commonly used by white folks. So this is the first place where we're seeing this separation and designation around like who can engage in recreational or medicinal use of substances, and having those folks that are targeted being like from a community of color. These laws were absolutely about social control. They were not about health, and they were linked to xenophobia and fear of quote unquote Chinese men corrupting white women. In the early 1900s, we see anti-Black and anti-Mexican drug laws, some connecting cocaine being connected to Black men in the South with claims that makes them bullet resistant, and then also marijuana being linked to Mexican immigrants during the wave of xenophobia and anti-immigrant hysteria that was happening in the 1930s. In 1937, we see the Marijuana Tax Act would criminalize cannabis, but specifically with racially coded propaganda, as we see here. In the 1970s, we have Nixon and a formal war on drugs. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one, launching the war on drugs. And yet, in 1968, when the Nixon campaign was happening, well, in 1994, John Erkman, I can't pronounce his name, but he was a policy advisor to Richard Nixon. And he said that we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the weekly news. So it was very intentional, again, politically motivated to decide to connect drugs or a substance with a particular community, and then to criminalize that community in order to stop their own personal advancements, or in this case, some anti-war demonstrations that were happening. In 1970, we have the Controlled Substance Act, which classifies drugs into schedules, making psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 says like there's no acceptable medicinal use, and then cutting off research and medical access that was happening. In the 1980s, Reagan escalates the war and it begins to expand criminal penalties, introducing mandatory minimums for folks that are incarcerated or arrested on drug crimes. There becomes the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, and that sentencing disparity is because crack was more closely connected with Black folks in the Black community, and powder cocaine was more connected with white folks, even though that connection was not actually true. It's just the way that politics and media spun in order to create this disparity, and then again to overcriminalize and police Black communities. We saw the Just Say No campaigns that painted drug users as criminals rather than people in need of care. And this had a severe impact on communities of color. By the 1990s, the prison population had exploded, with Black Americans incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans, and most of those offenses for incarceration were drug offenses. Despite similar use across communities, regardless of whether they were communities of color or not, BIPOC communities faced far higher arrest and convictions rate. And then this led to community mistrust, more policing, more criminalization of drug use, and these criminal offenses also led to a more increased law enforcement presence in these communities, and then public trust, and particularly trust of communities of color in connection with public institutions, whether they be government or law enforcement, continue to erode. I will say in the United States, the origins of law enforcement, it has racist beginnings. It is from the slave patrols back in the South that later become police enforcement. And so just being very clear that um, there was always a lack of trust because of the ways that law enforcement criminalized communities of color and the drug war, just say no to drugs, and over criminalization of communities of color connected to drug offenses only continue to erode that trust in these institutions. And then psychedelics were also, like said, like this is also harmful, right? These are things that we need to be concerned about, feeding moral and political panic as well. The long-term consequences are disenfranchisement. Um, we have voting rights, housing, and jobs that are all impacted by the war on drugs, family separation through incarceration, internalized shame in terms of healing with medicine, and this indoctrination into the idea that a drug cannot be medicinal, that it can only be harmful. And then there's also the lasting fear of being watched or punished for even exploring healing options by things that the government has indoctrinated us to believe are drugs. But the reality is that psychedelics have and always have were and always have been tools of liberation and resistance. So psychedelics were seen as a threat, not because they were harmful to public health, but because they were a threat to state control. In the early 60s and 70s, they were associated with anti-war protests, the civil rights movement, Black power and indigenous sovereignty movements. And folks like Timothy Leary, Angela Davis, Ram Dass helped spread the idea that it can provoke a radical consciousness shift that would lead to resistance against oppressive systems. Now, they were not necessarily specifically saying psychedelics would do that, but in response to this understanding of this radical shift of consciousness, um, the fear from politician and those in power was that this would lead to resistance against oppressive systems. And it does. It does. Psychedelics are often seen as a threat to state control, inspiring questions of authority, nonconformity, and collective healing, all which are bad to systems of oppression. And so the response is state repression and psychedelic suppression, and then a legacy of fear, risk, and information that is happening in communities. So with state repression and psychedelic suppression, we have the government responding with COINTELPRO, the FBI surveillance, and the criminalization of political activists, be they the Black Panthers, AIM, SNCC, and other activist groups were being monitored, and many leaders were criminalized under the guise of drug charges. The Controlled Substance Acts of 1970 also made growing medical research that was showing promise, brought all of that to a halt. And so the suppression of psychedelics wasn't just about public safety, it was also about neutralizing social movements and disrupting communities' calls for justice and peace. The legacy of risk and fear, even now, people are wondering, can I be arrested while doing this? So many times when I have colleagues that are in the psychedelic space, there's this fear of what it means to come out. And even myself as a provider, like I only work with ketamine because ketamine is legal and because I won't have to worry about being arrested for that. Also, I'm someone with multiple marginalized identities, and it is safer for me to do ketamine because, given the history of our country and what criminalization looks like, the likelihood is that if someone's going to be arrested, it's going to be me. And then also there's this, as folks are like maybe having more openness to psychedelics and like seeing the way that psychedelics and drugs can help in their family systems, being really afraid of their kids even engaging in legal psychedelic processes because of the fear of what's going to happen or the kids of getting profiled. And so then we have this general silence and this loss of understanding around how substances can be healing. And then medical mistrust also deepens the stigma. So the ways that psychedelics have been associated with government experimentation, like MK Ultra, and some overlaps with the Tuskegee study, even though that was not about psychedelics, it was about penicillin. Just the way that drug trials can impact entire communities, particularly communities that are under resourced and easy to take advantage of. And then also the healing potential of psychedelics ultimately ends up being buried under narratives of it being dangerous and you will go to jail. So when we're thinking about structural barriers in psychedelics, right, beyond the fear of criminalization, there are also very real structural barriers that impacts our ability to engage in psychedelics. And some of those barriers are cost and lack of insurance coverage, which kind of go hand in hand. So ketamine assisted therapy is the legal option that we have right now. And when I say legal, a prescriber is able to prescribe ketamine for off-label use. So not saying a prescriber says that we are using ketamine as a dissociative anesthetic, which is what it's approved for, but because of ketamine's schedule type and the fact that there has been evidence that it helps in terms of mental health, it can be prescribed for off-label use, but it's also very expensive. A cost for a session can range anywhere from 500 to 1,300, depending on where you're at in the country. And continuous sessions are required. When we're thinking about ketamine, a lot of the research shows that if you do multiple sessions, that's where you see the most impact, particularly in more medicalized research where it's like ketamine without psychotherapy sessions are going from 6 to 12 sessions in order to have an impact. And all of these expenses are out of pocket for clients, which creates an access divide where low income clients are priced out of this type of healing. And so ketamine is also not covered by insurance unless it's Spravato, which we'll talk about. And so it's coded as experimental or elective. There are some insurance companies, including Medi-Cal, that are starting to approve ketamine, but the credentialing process is slow and bureaucratic. Reimbursement is often delayed, discouraging clinics from serving insured clients. And then FDA approves Spravato, which is esketamine, which is approved, is highly regulated and underused by marginalized communities due to the complexity of even being able to be qualified as a Spravato provider, and then all of the things that you have to do in order to maintain compliance with Spravato. So the question is Spravato a pathway for access or actually another barrier? And this is when I say we're going to explore some of the options that are available. Spravato is an option that is available to folks that are interested in ketamine, but it's a pretty daunting process. So Spravato is the brand name for esketamine. It's a nasal spray that's derived from ketamine. It got FDA approved in 2019 for treatment-resistant depression and major depression with suicide ideation. It's administered in office under supervision, typically twice a week to start, and then tapering down over the months. So the process for providing Spravato is laid out here. So first you have to go through a credentialing and REMS certification, and REMS is risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. And then providers and facilities must follow strict monitoring protocols even for that process. The next step is the initial psychiatric assessment, where a psychiatric diagnosis must be given, and it has to either be major depression with suicide ideation or treatment resistant depression. And there's all of these things that are required for treatment resistant depression. So sometimes it's like you have to have tried X number of medication. It might be 2 medications, it might be 3 medications. Some people require that you have tried to do electromagnetic therapy or ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Some people require that you have tried TMS. There's like all these things that have to be knocked off before you can even be qualified to have treatment resistant depression. And that in and of itself, getting that type of depressive, it's not an official diagnosis, but to meet criteria for treatment resistant depression, there's all of these ways that you have to engage with the mental health system and all of these things that you have to try first in order to even be a candidate for Spravato. And then so you'll get the diagnosis after having gone through all these other mental health kind of checkpoints. And then you in that psychiatric evaluation, there's a full medical history, a psych evaluation, and then there has to be medical clearance. So already we're at step two. And there's so much that has to happen even to be able to get to step two. And it's really, it's a huge barrier for a lot of people, not just people that are in communities of color, but period, to get to this point. There's so many barriers that and hurdles that you have to be able to jump over. And then we get to the onboarding part. So step three is onboarding into the REMS, and there's prior authorizations. So you have to be enrolled as a patient into the Spravato REMS program. And then the provider has to obtain a prior authorization from your insurance company. And that prior authorization can take anywhere from weeks to months for you to be able, even be authorized to be able to receive Spravato and have that reimbursed. Then there's consent forms and safety education that is a part of that onboarding process. But now we're at the point where after having tried, who knows, maybe for years, these um, depression modalities, like different medications. Usually for medication, depending on what it is, it might take 4 to 6 weeks for there even to be an assessment of whether or not the medication is working, for the medication effect to take on. And then there's assessment if you have to do that 3 times. We're talking about multiple months, if not years, to even get to this part of your prior authorization, and then you have to wait additional weeks to months in order to get the insurance company to authorize it. Step four is the administration and monitoring, and this is when the ketamine is actually administered intranasally into office. And there's 2 hours of monitoring that is required post-dose. There's pressure checks, other types of vital checks, and mental status monitoring. And then the client must have a ride home and cannot drive until the next day. And then we get to the step five, which is treatment, which is ongoing treatment for twice weekly for 4 weeks, or weekly for 4 weeks, and then biweekly or monthly maintenance if it is successful. And then insurance will cover the cost of the drug, but not the therapist's presence or any sort of integration work. So there are a lot of pros to Spravato, particularly when we're thinking about marginalized communities. If someone is from a marginalized community and they have insurance, Spravato is covered by many insurances, including Medi-Cal, Medicare, and private plans. It offers a legally sanctioned psychedelic option for in a clinical setting and can be administered at federally qualified health centers and community clinics. And also may reduce the stigma of, because it is FDA approved and not quote unquote street ketamine, which has a really negative reputation, and even providers that are long-term providers of ketamine or other psychedelics have this, ketamine has this real stigma about being addictive and its addictive potential. Some of the cons of Spravato is it's highly medicalized and clinical. It can feel cold and disconnected to engage through this entire process. There's no therapy that's built into the model. And so like, yeah, you have the experience, but how do you understand how that experience shows up in your life, and how you can make meaning of it, and how you can take those lessons and apply it, which research shows that the therapeutic component is also really necessary for psychedelic experiences when we're thinking about it in terms of healing and maybe not just recreation. And most likely that's what these folks are going to be coming for after having to meet qualifications for treatment-resistant depression. And it can also be re-traumatizing. If you have medical trauma, if this is not culturally attuned, it can be really hard. There's very rigid protocols that are involved with this very particular way of administering ketamine. There's no flexibility for spiritual, ceremonial, or cultural adaptations. You have to do it specifically according to the protocol. It requires transportation, it requires time off work, and also consistent follow-up. So all of these can be hard for folks that are multiply marginalized and come from communities that are under-resourced. And also, I want to be really clear that I don't think everybody in a community of color is under-resourced. That is not true. And the reality is that many communities of color face these systemic barriers that lead to them being under-resourced. And when we're thinking about communities collectively and who's able to have access to psychedelic healing, often it tends not to be those folks that are from communities of color. But what could Spravato look like for communities of color? You know, if we have community-based clinics, with diverse providers who reflect the population, there can be some ease around some of the coldness and potential for medical trauma. Maybe there can be an additional add-on of wraparound services where integration therapy, peer support, food, transportation stipends are offered by clinics or maybe nonprofits that have the ability to raise money to bring those types of resources to those places. There is the possibility of group Spravato sessions, which can allow for cultural attunement. And you have to be careful because you have to follow the protocol specifically, but there, maybe you can be flexible. I don't know. But outside of like the actual Spravato sessions, there's the opportunity to build trust with community ambassadors and not just prescribing doctors, to employ care around like what is happening with Spravato, to leverage a Medi-Cal reimbursement with philanthropic dollars to kind of cover uncovered services, which is one of the approaches that we're using in our practice is and we're going to talk about Medi-Cal in a little bit, but finding a way to like get portions of the treatment covered by Medi-Cal insurance and then rely on philanthropy to be able to fill in the gaps for medicine sessions. But the biggest question that I have when we're looking at Spravato as an option is what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing what is being offered over how the thing is being offered? And for me, it really feels like Spravato is a very medical model, very research based, and it is the ketamine is the thing that is going to help, and it doesn't matter how we do it. And that's just not culturally resonant for communities of color, particularly communities of color that have experienced medical trauma and medical racism. And so generally, outside of Spravato in the field as a whole, there's this very much of this cultural mismatch in training and practice. So mainstream training programs are often led by white providers. They're really allopathic or Western medicine centric. And if there is the inclusion of indigenous medicine, it's kind of a one-off. It's not integrated throughout. So, I do a lot of lectures. I feel like I've been a guest lecturer in almost every training program that does anything related to psychedelics. And one thing that just is true, and a lot of the feedback that I get from the students is like, I am one of the only lectures that people are getting. And so there is not a way that in some of the major psychedelic training programs, this concept of um like infusing a culture or the realities or perspectives of communities of color is happening throughout the training program. It is often that a lecturer or a few lecturers are coming in and is a separate segment, which means that the training program's basis, the paradigms under which the training programs are teaching about psychedelic care, are not from a place that is culturally resonant with communities of color, but a place that separately will then additionally include communities of color. And so often BIPOC trainees report feeling isolated, tokenized, and dismissed when raising cultural concerns that are relevant to what's happening. And then there's a lack of curriculum that addresses historical harm, community care models, and racial trauma, which is why I always start with history. Um, and then this ultimately ends up with the lack of connection or a disconnection between the needs of communities of color and their providers, right? Often they're not huge. I mean, CIS in Cal has done a really good job of like trying to recruit more diverse participants. And so I know at one point CIS had a cohort where I think it was like a third or a fourth of the cohort was from a community of color, and then Cal had a cohort where half of it was from a marginalized community. And like having folks in the room is like absolutely a great step and something to be applauded. And also the training has to speak to those people's cultural ideologies, paradigms, conceptions, in order to actually be relevant in terms of the instruction. And so I, as someone that moved through a lot of different psychedelic training programs, I actually had to go outside of the psychedelic field and psychedelic training to get what I needed. in order to meet my clients in a place that was culturally resonant because it wasn't showing up in my training. And then we also see this lack of representation in clinical trials. Clinical trials, there is plenty of research that has been done to show just how many people that are the subjects in these clinical trials are from communities of color. There is criticism that major conferences and organizations lack Black, Indigenous, Latinx speakers and roles. And like there, the MAPS conference this past conference had a Black liberation track, which was amazing. And also, how can these types of things be integrated into more of the conferences we see? I'll also say that Tracuna does a really good job of having entire conferences that are like speaking to the voice of communities of color, whether it's psychedelics and culture, I think was their last conference. So it's present, but it's not necessarily as widestream or mainstream as like the number of people that are going to be seeking psychedelic services and healing are going to need coming from these communities. And then often when we see dominant media narratives, whether it's something on Netflix or Hulu or Vice, predominantly they're highlighting white facilitators or celebrities or Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, which those perspectives are absolutely important and necessary, and they're not exhaustive and all inclusive. So we also need to be bringing in community leaders into those conversations as well. And then we move into psychedelic exceptionalism, right? Psychedelic exceptionalism is the belief that psychedelics are so special and so powerful that they're above criticism. They don't have to follow the rules and they should be separated from quote unquote other drugs. And then in doing this exceptionalism, it erases the criminalization and punishment that BIPOC communities have faced for the same substances. And it creates this it is more othering, it is actually more opportunity to criminalize. So if someone is saying, well, I do mushrooms but I don't do crack, well then crack is the thing that you go to jail for and mushrooms don't. It's very much like I do cocaine and I don't do crack. Both can be penalties for crack are so much higher than the penalties for cocaine, even though they're exactly the same substance, they're just processed differently. And so we have to be aware and we have a responsibility as people in this field that are pushing for drug reform to not leave out other drugs and to not decide that psychedelics are something separate or other than drugs that people are going to be criminalized for. Because if we do not and we engage in psychedelic exceptionalism, then we are being complicit in the war on drugs. We are being complicit in criminalization in BIPOC and marginalized communities. We are actively participating in that separation and increased incarceration for folks that might not necessarily look like us, because regardless if we're all using it, much as so which would happen with crack and cocaine, much as so which would happen with marijuana, it is still going to be the communities of color that are going to go to jail, even if we're all engaging in these drugs and medicines. So psychedelics were a part of the war on drugs, and today's narrative frames them as medicine in white predominant spaces, and it erases the history of incarcerated users, elders, and traditional healers that, have been at risk for centuries, I mean, not centuries, for decades since the war on drugs, and continuing to have this available to us as a medicinal place, as a recreational place, as a place for whatever we need in relation to psychedelics. And legalization is not helpful. It often prioritizes access for investors and not those harmed by prohibition. And it creates more of these roadblocks. Like we see the process in order to be able to engage with Spravato and how daunting and complex. Like that is what legalization looks like. And decriminalization, which we'll talk about in a little bit, offers a little bit more flexibility. And so also again, in response to what we have seen in our political system, our socio-political environment right now, DEI rollbacks are also happening in the psychedelic space. So after racial uprisings in 2020, racial uprisings in 2020 specifically related to the murder of Black men and women by the police. Psychedelic orgs, among so many organizations throughout the country, began making DEI commitments, but many of the roles were underfunded, it was performative, and it was temporary. And DEI fatigue now is how it's used to excuse and recenter narratives that do not include diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are finding that many DEI staff and positions are being laid off, and even major psychedelic organizations are participating in the removal of DEI positions and roles in those aspects of their training programs. Equity conversations are now being avoided and minimized because our political climate has now made it socially acceptable to do so. So in response to racial uprisings and the political climate of justice, right, we got all of these DEI commitments. And now, in response to our political climate as it is now, where DEI is being demonized, we have all these DEI rollbacks. And this is a sweatshirt that we sell in our organization. And I did it, we were selling it at the MAPS conference. And specifically, I did it in response to like what our 501c3 is about, which is psychedelic access. And the fact that it's been very clear that access for some folks and organizations is a trend and not a commitment. And so our claim and our stance is that psychedelic access is a commitment, not a trend. And a commitment to psychedelic access means long-term, values-driven, dedicating resources and engaging in the redistribution of power to those that are not in power. And the trend are short-lived initiatives that focus on optics over outcomes with no community accountability and a lack of true structural change. So if anything you take away from this presentation when we're talking about what we actually have to do to overcome stigma and what the options are available. Like, I ask that you make a commitment to psychedelic access in ways that are accessible and meaning to you, and don't allow that to be a trend for you. So when we talk about stigma, we can't just act like stigma happens outside of communities of color. We have spent a couple of decades being indoctrinated into the idea that drugs are bad. And so that means that there are multiple ways that stigma around medicine, psychiatry, and drugs has showed up, particularly in these communities. So we have the mistrust of psychiatric systems. Many BIPOC communities or communities of color associate therapy with pathology or state surveillance. I still, myself, as someone that's in this field, am like, I don't want a diagnosis. I don't want you to diagnose me, because then that's going to follow me and people are going to track me. And like, that is such a real fear that so many people have from engaging in medical trauma or medical racism. And what it means. Are your records protected? Are they not protected? I'm very cautious about diagnoses that I'm willing to have put on paper. And so too are many people in communities of color. This association with pathology and state surveillance is very real. There's the idea that psychedelics are for white people and they're not for anybody else because of the freedoms that are allowed and the risk that comes with criminalization. And the fact that psychedelics, there's this fear that it also might be linked to institutional control as well. A lot of providers are wondering, like, am I being watched? I've had conversations with my colleagues about like, we're all probably on somebody's watch list. And it's not something that's not true. It is something that is a real fear, and that we are being watched. That when we speak publicly, that there is this type of surveillance that's happening, and it's in connection with being a leader and someone that's stepping forward and like creating space for others, but we do so at great risk. And then there's also the historical trauma from medical racism with longstanding distrust due to systemic abuse. When we think about the Tuskegee experiments, when we think about forced sterilizations that have happened in communities of colors and other marginalized communities, non-consensual testing on Black and Indigenous populations, and the fact that psychedelics are offered through a Western psychiatric model that triggers suspicion rather than trust and healing. And then within communities, drug use is morally judged. Like, we all were impacted by those media images that the advisor to Nixon was talking about. Was very intentional to create associations between different drugs and different communities of color. And the belief and acceptance of those things is something that we all took on. And so there it's linked to this moral judgment is linked to religious beliefs, it's linked to respectability politics, it's linked to poverty shaming, it's linked to survival strategies in terms of trying to navigate around surveillance and harm. And choosing psychedelic healing for many people is isolating. If they're in a community of color, like you can't talk to everyone about it. You can't talk to your friends. You can't talk to your parents. You can't talk to your family, even when it's done legally and intentionally. And so there's this other thing that we must address, which is community level stigma around psychedelics as well. And so I know we have 15 minutes left. I definitely want to try and get some Q&A. So I'm going to move through these next one a little bit quickly, but what is possible, right? So not in any particular order. It is possible to be credentialed with Medi-Cal and to offer to do insurance billing for insurance reimbursement for everything around the medicine session. So prep and integration sessions can be billed at 90837 if you're a psychotherapist. They can be billed in terms of the E&M codes if you're a prescriber and there's a medical oversight and a prescriber is present. And E&M is evaluation and management codes. So that's like 99213 or something like that. 99, I don't know the other one. There are billing codes that you can use to be able to get a portion of that treatment either covered in the therapeutic context or reimbursed through insurance reimbursement. However, that does nothing for community use. Again, it requires that someone has to come into an office in order to be able to receive that type of care. But group therapy or community therapy is also another way that we can think about kind of bringing down the barrier, whether that's at a community clinic that might be able to have space for groups to come in and engage in like some of the prep and integration group processing, or actually billing therapy for group therapy in a traditional therapeutic setting. Our organization, Doorway Therapeutics, actually has we are authorized to be a Medi-Cal provider through Alameda Alliance. And so we are trying to find ways to bridge psychedelics, prep and integration with Medi-Cal, and then fill in philanthropic support for the medicine sessions for the places that aren't covered by insurance. And then we do out-of-network billing for folks that don't have Medi-Cal. And there's also ways to collaborate with people in the community, with psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, prescribers, and trying to make sure that the models or ways of engaging aren't always medically focused or medically rooted. And there are absolutely therapists and even physicians and nurses that don't buy into this is about medicine and molecules and buy into that this is about so much more. When we think about building cultural trust, collaborating with community partners is really important. So churches and spiritual institutions are places to build collaborations. Working with QT BIPOC-led grassroots organizations, whether they're psychedelic centered or not. And then connecting with community health workers and doulas, connecting with people in the underground, because people trust relationships more than they trust credentials when it comes to doing this work in ways that are not medicalized. I have a outline of the process of getting REM certified, but in the service of time, I'm happy to offer that as a PDF that you guys can receive or link to that in some way. Very briefly, states are doing something as well. So I just want to say that don't look at the image of this. I couldn't figure out how to uncolor these states. So the colors and numbers don't mean anything. But states where it's fully legal or there's therapeutic programs are Oregon, Colorado, and New Mexico. Where there's decriminalized or law enforcement are Oregon, DC, California, Michigan, Maine, Minnesota, and Washington. And places where they're currently polling legislation is California, Arizona, Alaska, Minnesota, Nevada, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, Virginia, and Rhode Island. And in response to this very patriotic and sarcastic slideshow, on July 5th, let me I want to get the exact date right. July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a keynote address at the Independence Day celebration and asked, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Because I always say on the 4th of July, it doesn't matter because the next day, July 5th, my ancestors were still enslaved. And so, what to communities of color is the psychedelic renaissance? If it's not going to include us, if it's not going to consider us, if it's going to have all of these barriers of access, what does the renaissance actually mean to us? This promise of freedom and liberation that psychedelics offer has to be a promise to us all. And if it's not a promise to us all, then who really cares? I mean, maybe the people that will benefit will care, but I don't. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you,
Q&A time.
Courtney. Thank you so much. You eloquently laid this out from the historical past to where we are today, which does in a lot of ways feel like two steps forward, many steps back with our current administration. And I think having these conversations is so important for us to understand how the work that you're doing and other people working in BIPOC communities and white folks too can all stand together to move forward and make changes in the present with the psychedelic field. So thank you so much
Sure.
for laying this all out for us. And we do have time for questions, so I encourage anyone who has one to please drop it in the Q&A. And while you're putting your questions there, I'll just kick us off with one. What do you feel is like the biggest obstacle or barrier for operating a clinic like Access to Doorways? And if you could wave a magic wand, what would you
Mhm.
do to address that?
Honestly, for me, one of the biggest barriers is stigma around drugs within communities of color. I remember I was working with a aunt, my aunt, and my family is super supportive of what I do. They don't understand it. Nobody wants to try it. They're like, great for you. But I think that that's part of it, right? And order to really fully actualize the potential of these medicines, these technologies, these tools, these spirits, these entities, right? In order to fully actualize them, like we have to know that they're safe for us. And so, like, really unlearning that stigma that came from the war on drugs and deeply impacted communities of color is like one of the biggest barriers that I would love to just like go away so that we can actually do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Another barrier is expenses. Like, I joke because people will often refer people to me in my clinic and say, "Oh, Courtney it's a Black-led organization and they offer a sliding scale. They're accessible." And I'm like, that's not true. It is true that I'm Black-led, but I charge the same amount as everybody else because I'm not going to participate in the wage gap. I'm not going to be underpaid. I demand that I get paid the same as everyone. So that means that everybody in the psychedelic field sets my fee, right? If we all collectively bring our fees down, then my fees will go down too. But as long as the fees are where they're at, and I live in Oakland, which is like one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, honestly, I'm going to charge the same amount as everyone else. So cost is a huge barrier. Now, I'm not going to sit and be like, we charge the same amount as everyone else and not do anything about it. Access to Doorways was born because I wanted to create a way for people to be able to receive ketamine therapy. We got credentialed to be able to offer Medi-Cal so that we could meet people where they were at. Low income communities might have a pathway to psychedelic care. But the reality is, cost is still a huge barrier, and we haven't quite figured out how to get folks' medicine sessions covered so that it's all taken care of.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a huge barrier. And do you feel that some of the spiritual communities might be a path forward where it's a larger group, say 30 people that are receiving medicine at the same time?
I mean, 30 people receiving that medicine at the same time sounds absolutely wild to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd advocate for that. But I do think that I really want to find my way into Black churches. Like there's a Black pastor that I don't identify as Christian. I'm not a Christian, but that doesn't mean I don't have a relationship with Christianity or particularly Black Christianity. And there's a Black pastor that I love, Christian A. Smith. Like if I ever meet him, I want to talk to him about psychedelics and find a way to talk about psychedelics and bring it to his platform. And because he's so real, he's like what I feel like Jesus would be like, yes, that's my dude. Like, that's what I want. And I think that there are a lot of Black pastors and a lot of Black clergy that are more radical. Like, I do know Black clergy that engage in psychedelic care, psychedelic work, or have been doing psychedelic training. And like getting our foot into the Black church community, particularly for Black folks, is an amazing place where we're really going to see that stigma fall down. Do I think that there are a lot of Black Christians that are willing to do that now as it stands with all of the stigma around drugs? No. Also,
Mhm.
when we talk about academic institutions and HBCUs, I'm doing some work looking at HBCUs. I'm doing some work with, there are HBCUs that are interested in psychedelics and how it's going to happen, but also we have to be real that respectability politics is something that impacts the Black community. And that's a huge barrier, another moral barrier in terms of getting destigmatizing drug use for our communities.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's important to understand that the trust may be there in church communities, traditional church communities, but we still have a long way to go with integrating psychedelics in these models. Okay, great. Well, I'll get to the audience questions here. So our first one, there's a lot of compliments here too about your talk, but I'll just skip to the question. Are there any groups like Tracruna you recommend to find community amongst other BIPOC psychedelic practitioners?
Um, I think that if you go to the conferences or conferences that are next to you and you see either a bunch of folks that are from communities of color or a sprinkling of folks, depending on the type of conference that you go to, that you go and you connect with that person, right? Like, I think it's very much of an individual thing. I can't say any one place is the domain where you find folks. Roots to Fruit is an organization that is doing work for Black folks. Like, I've seen different places pop up, but I personally am really leery about these places that have like hundreds and hundreds of people on their listserv and hundreds of people showing. And again, this is my fear of surveillance, right? Like, this is the thing that I'm talking about is not something that I don't live. I also do have this fear of surveillance, and I think people need to be cautious because I do believe that we're being surveilled. I do think marginalized communities that have these large groups and these large listservs are being surveilled. So I'd say take it on a one-to-one situation or do a vetting process, going through the grapevine. Do you know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody and they're verified by a couple of different people that you trust? And I know that's really hard when you're very fresh and new in the space and you don't know anybody. And so I'll just say, listen to your body and listen and be discerning. Like, what does your gut say about someone? And trust that. And if you don't find a deep yes in you when you connect with someone, then maybe even if it's the only person that you've seen in a decade, right? Wait another decade for the person that's going to be the deep yes for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good and good practical advice there. Okay, so the next question is, how will the big beautiful bill impact people uh, who use state insurance to access psychedelic healing and integration?
How will the big, beautiful bill?
Our current political administration, any sense about state insurance, how that might impact
I'm
ketamine?
not a policy person and I don't
Okay.
watch the news. I know it's a shit show and I'm a therapist and I cannot watch the news and also support my clients. So I don't know the inner workings of this bill. I just hold my breath and cross my fingers and then my clients will tell me everything that I need to be afraid of.
Yeah. It does seem to
So
be negatively impacting Medicaid,
that's
Medi-Cal,
what I
and
hear. That's what I
insurance
hear. But
coverage.
I'm also like, we'll see, so I see a question about what do you suggest for states where none of those progressive steps are happening, like Louisiana. And the reality is, I live in California. I used to live in Louisiana before, and I used to have this dream of going back to New Orleans and retiring there. And I'm not leaving California anymore. And so, like, in terms of this question about the bill, I have a lot of trust, not absolute trust, but I have a lot of trust in the politicians that are in California to make sure that we're good. And so I can't speak to the bill in terms of the nation, but if there is local government that you can connect with or local government that feels good to you, like how do you partner with them or build up those politicians that are like drug friendly or something like that in order to feel safer where you're at?
Hmm. Okay, we're gonna have time for one more question, but I'm gonna make it a two-part question. And this is about what are the best training for white people to learn how to treat BIPOC communities. And I would just say, maybe just could you add a few practical things that if you're a practitioner and you're white or
Mhm.
you work in a diverse clinic, what can you do to be more welcoming towards diverse individuals?
There is nary a talk I do where this question does not come up. Not a talk. And uh it's a hard question for me to answer um because I'm not white, and it's hard for me to know how to educate. I mean, like, white is so big and white is so expansive and white means so many different things. I don't know. I'd say do some anti-racist training, connect with anti-racist people, give money to BIPOC organizations that are doing the work. You don't have to do all the work, refer. You don't have to be the person that sees everybody. And if you don't know anybody to refer to, then you need to fix that. If you do not have a person from a community of color is not enough. If you don't have multiple people from multiple communities of colors that you're in relationship with, real and authentic relationship with, in order to connect with and refer, when you're faced with something that you don't know how to face, then you need to go and do that now. Like, you need to find people now. Go on Psychology Today and start building relationships with people.
That's great. And I'm going to just drop this paper in the chat, and it's by Monica Williams, who did a lot of work with MAPS, Lycos to help bring more diversity to the clinicians that were treating patients in the trials, as well as to recruit more individuals from diverse backgrounds. So there's some ideas there that they came up with to kind of be more inclusive and
There's like a lot of anti-racist groups in the Bay Area, because I'm in the Bay Area. And I just say, if you are here and you're watching and you know of local anti-racist groups, to put them in the chat, so that people can follow up to see if there's anything local to them. And then find someone that can help you that's white and is doing anti-racist work and further along than you are.
That's great. Okay, well, we'll be mindful of the time here. Thank you so much. We will share the video. And if you want to share the PDF or any other resources you have, we'd be happy to put that in the email, which we send out as a follow-up. And I applaud your work and I encourage everybody to check out Courtney's site. And I'm going to drop the links again in case you missed those.
Yeah, and I put my email in the chat. I'm super
Okay.
accessible. Don't feel like you can't talk to me if you have a question. Probably not the white question, because I feel like that was answered a couple of different ways, but you have other questions about how to connect. Or if you want to donate, if you want a sweatshirt, like, all these things, if you want to know which organizations I would say are a good place to give money so that you could do your part, because that's what you got, like, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to point you in those directions.
All right, excellent. And someone is asking, where can we order from your shop to support?
I'd
So,
say email me because I don't have it online. I just sell them at conferences. But I actually am wearing one. We have a crop top hoodie.
oh
It has the
yeah,
definition of access, and the back is what was on the screen, a commitment, not a trend. Um and Brett, if you want to reach out to me because you're in Louisiana, I'm gonna be in Louisiana in 2 weeks, in New Orleans, because I go there often. I'd love to connect.
excellent. That's my home state. So
Oh, really? Love it.
we chatted about that some time back, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll see you all back here again next month for our monthly speaker series. And take care.
Can you save the chat for me, please?
Yes, I can. I'll
Okay.
send it to you.
Thank you. All
All
right.
right,
Bye,
great.
everybody.
Thanks. Take care.